Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be going through everything that I picked up within the month of June. As always, I'll have all of this broken down by genre, so that way if there's one genre you're more so interested in, you can skip ahead to that. Also, I'm still technically filming this within the month of June, so there's a few that I'll bring up that I've only just started, so we won't go as in-depth, of course, with those today, but you can kind of be on the lookout for those in either a future wrap-up or an end-of-the-quarter style of video. And then one last thing to note before we jump officially into it is that for a lot of these, I have done reviews for them, and I'll have those linked so that in case you'd like to hear more in-depth thoughts, that's available to you as well. As for the genres that we'll be exploring today, of course, as usual, the bulk of this will be for fantasy and science fiction, but then we also have nonfiction, romantasy, romance, and then light novels, manga, and I know light novels and manga are a little bit more so different mediums than they are different genres, but for the sake of consistency, I just label it as a different genre. We'll go ahead and kick things off with the nonfiction, and that would be Cuba and American History. This was absolutely fantastic, Pulitzer Prize winner, and very, very, very well deserved. It is incredibly well researched, and also it's a little bit dense, I will say, for a nonfiction. I think, of course, there are different kinds of nonfiction books, some of which are a little bit easier to get into because it's like a memoir, for example, and so it's a little bit more personal, it's easy to connect to, and this one is a little bit closer to like a textbook, you could say, because it is going through a lot of information. However, not only do I feel like the information was incredibly well researched, and I also feel like it was delivered in a way that allowed for you to kind of take in the broader points that I think are really significant, but also I just continuously found myself, for even just small pockets of information that were being conveyed, I kept thinking like, oh, I want to learn more about this. I want to learn more about this person or this time. Specifically, I now want to read about Jose Marti because fascinating figure within history that I knew nothing about before this. If you don't know, a little bit personal to me as well, as my grandparents are from Cuba, and unfortunately, they have never been able to return. My grandmother passed away before ever having that opportunity. My grandfather is quite old at this point, so I don't think will ever be able to return home, even though I know my grandmother would always talk about how beautiful Cuba was, and it's interesting growing up as an American whose family members were from Cuba, because I don't think I realized before this book just how connected Cuban history and American history is. So for example, something that the book, it's not necessarily saying this would have happened absolutely, it's kind of something you can infer by reading about just how much a lot of Americans were vying for control over Cuba, is that if it hadn't been for our Civil War, likely Cuba would have become a part of the United States, just because of how slave trade at that time was being eradicated in certain places or outlawed in certain places, and America was still very much grasping onto that. And then also certain kind of wealthier people within Cuba were, in a similar way to how America wanted independence from England, you kind of see Cuba sort of wanted that from Spain. But part of the catalyst for that, for the wealthy within Cuba, was that they wanted to maintain control over their wealth, which included slavery. And so they kind of looked at the US and they're like, well, I like what those guys are doing, and Spain is kind of, I don't know, I don't really like, I'm paraphrasing and making it sound very, very casual, and honestly, I'm dumbing it down. Basically though, wealthy individuals in Cuba that were tired of Spain telling them how to govern, what they were allowed to do, they didn't really like that, so they kind of wanted their independence from Spain, and weirdly wanted to gain that by having an alliance with the US and maybe even becoming part of the US. So that was like an interest that they had in Cuba. Not all Cubans, of course, but usually the ones that held a lot of power. And then in America, a lot of Americans are like, yeah, we should take Cuba. They're very helpful to us. They have a lot of resources we like. They had, for example, a very abundant sugar trade. So they wanted that. Also, the way that the transatlantic slave trade was taking place, they were kind of bouncing off of each other a lot in that regard. And it's really fascinating because, at least for my education growing up, something that my husband and I actually did a whole discussion for this over on my Patreon if you're interested in that. But one of the things that we kind of kept coming back to is that I don't think I realized how much Cuba was in the conversation with our politicians throughout pretty much most of America. When I say America, I mean United States. Most of the United States' history. I didn't realize just how much they were really wanting to attain it. And you have Jefferson being like, I think we should take it. And John Quincy Adams being like, I think eventually it'll be ours. The time just isn't right just yet. And again, I'm dumbing everything down and I'm making historical figures sound like idiots. And some of them, honestly, were pretty horrible people. So I don't feel too bad about that. But it was fascinating. It was fascinating to learn. And it was really important for understanding why there are certain views in Cuba, or why there is such a complicated history with the United States, but also so much of the rest of the world as well. Someone like Nelson Mandela being like, if it wasn't for the Cubans, I don't think that there would have been this turnout that occurred in this place. And a lot of the, I think there's a lack of awareness and understanding like why Cuba got to the place that it did, and also the role that the United States played in that. And one of the big kind of overarching things I think is fully encompassed within just the way that we even title certain events in history. So as an example, eventually Cuba really did want its independence from Spain, and not just wealthy individuals that just wanted to partake more in the slave trade. Beyond just that, there were people that just genuinely were like, we want our independence. And how they wanted to gain their independence was through a very unified message. So you had people of different races and backgrounds coming together because they wanted to be Cuba. They wanted this unity. They were right about to gain their independence from Spain. And then America, you know, we don't know the entirety of the details behind this event, but very conveniently, one of our ships blew up. We used this as a reason to not only declare war, but to insert ourselves on Cuban soil to help defend them, even though very clearly they were going to win this war and they had their independence. When the war did end, the United States came together with Spaniards to discuss basically the spoils of war. How are we going to divvy things up? And also the United States decided they were going to determine how the Spaniards would be punished, or who was still in Cuba and how they would be treated, and if they could keep their positions. And they did not allow Cubans to partake in this conversation. So Cuba fought their own war. They were just at the end, and then America swooped in and decided to pick up the pieces that were left after the war. And this is referred to, at least in American history, the United States history, as the American Spanish War. And you're like, that's not what that was. This was the Cuban War of Independence. And it's just, that I think is a perfect example to understand the way that Cuba has pretty much throughout a lot of its history just been trying to have its own independence, and how America has imposed how other countries have come through. And then the book does kind of start initially much before that, and kind of the first Europeans that came to the Americas. And that whole section, while there's not as many documents to reveal to us what transpired in a lot of detail, but absolutely horrific. I know a lot of people know this, I've known this, but some of the examples are hard to read about because they are just so brutal. Of course, everything to do with the enslavement of other people is also horrific. So this book is really showing a lot of things that are truly, truly terrible, but how all of these pieces have built upon each other to create this very complicated history, not just for Cuba, but for Cuba and its connection to the United States. Highly recommend. Just know that it is a history text. So it's something that you probably want to let yourself kind of take in. And if you can, the same way that my husband and I read it together and then we were able to discuss it, if there's someone you can read this with, I would definitely recommend that. I think it makes it a lot easier to kind of process the information, discuss it. There's a lot of names, there's a lot of dates, and I think most people agree that that's not necessarily the important part. It is more of what you extract from this to better understand present day, but also how history informs present day. I think those are the important pieces, but still, if you're unaccustomed to reading this sort of nonfiction, it's, I think, very helpful to have another person to discuss with. I highly recommend. Thought it was fantastic. And I definitely plan to learn more about Cuba. I thought it was great. Anyway, moving on now. That was kind of heavy. There's some heavy topics in that one. So let's move just very, very, very briefly. I'll just go through light novels and manga. One of the light novels I've only just started, and I hope to finish at least the first one, if not two entries into this. And I should clarify, I think technically they're not considered light novels because they're from a different place, but they're similar to light novels, so apologies. Heaven Official's Blessing, though, is the one that I'm referring to. I've just started the first one, hope to finish the first one, and then the second one pretty soon, so I can't comment on it really too much, but I have officially started Heaven Official's Blessing. And then I don't need to elaborate because I've elaborated many times pretty much this whole year. I have continued to read and reread Witch Hat Atelier. And also, I've been reading more of Witch Hat Atelier Kitchen. This is something I read very slowly, even though it's very easy to get through. Just because anytime I need like just something a little bit sweet and nice as a break between other things, I'll read a couple chapters of Witch Hat Atelier Kitchen, and it still continues to be the most precious, wholesome thing. And it needs to be the reality for the characters all the time, though, is the thing. Because they've been put through too much. Anyway, so that's kind of a quick overview for light novels and manga. Let's talk about some science fiction. I was going to save science fiction and fantasy for the end, but we'll jump into science fiction now. So the two that I picked up would be Too Like the Lightning and Left Hand Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Similar to Cuba and American History, I actually buddy read Left Hand of Darkness with my husband and did a discussion also over on Patreon for that if you're interested. But this book, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd always heard about it as kind of this foundational work within science fiction, but I'd never read it and I really didn't know what it was about. And this is a book where I think the best way to put it is that I really appreciate and value, that's my dog if you hear her grumbling. I really appreciate and value this book, and bless you, I think it has a lot to offer, and I think it was very ahead of its time, because some of the discussions within this are ones that if you put in a book now, people even now might think like, oh, this is really out there. But I loved the conversations that were being had in this. Also, she's a great writer, so I appreciated all of that. I can't say I was invested the same way I am invested in some of the other books that I really, really enjoy. Part of it is that I do think that sci-fi at this time, I'm not incredibly well versed, but I do think there's kind of this idea of hard sci-fi, which is about ideas a lot of times and exploring those to their final form. And as such, they are very concept driven, and I think concept driven books are great moments for discussion, and they provide a great catalyst for interrogating your own thoughts, how you see the world, and that is incredibly valuable. And I don't feel like it's even quite right to say like, oh, but like I didn't love these characters. I wasn't like, oh my gosh, is somebody gonna die? I don't feel like that's the point. So I want to recognize that it is important to have works like this one, but I also kind of selfishly am like, I think some authors are able to do this and make me care a lot about the characters. So I'm really just saying like I want it all. But that doesn't change the fact that I thought this book was incredible. If you don't know anything about Left Hand of Darkness, similar to me when I picked it up, it is a first contact story at its core, but I don't really feel like that's saying really everything that this book is discussing, because there is more to the first contact than just, oh, we're very different from each other, and I have my background and you have yours. It gets so much deeper than that, especially because this particular society, literally these people on this planet, their makeup is very different from our protagonists. And as a result, that kind of forces the protagonist to try to understand how their makeup impacts their culture and how it's entirely different from anything he's experienced before, and how he cannot help but impose onto them, whether on a subconscious level or just kind of how he thinks about things. He can't help but insert his own kind of preconceived views of things onto these people, and how they also see him as an oddity because he's different from them. But how we can break down our own views on these sorts of things as well. And I don't really want to say too much of what those things are, because I want to allow for anybody who was like me, who didn't know a whole lot about it, I want them to be able to go in with this experience as well. I think it enhanced it personally to just kind of sit with it and be like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, huh. And with having buddy read it with my husband, it was kind of funny because, the idea of like, oh, they're different in their makeup. He's like, have you gotten to how they're different yet? And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure they're like this. And he's like, okay. And then the further in, you're like, oh, they make it very clear. Very clear. And then I think it's just so interesting to see how she dissects all of that. And I think she has a background, her parents especially, had backgrounds in anthropology, if I'm not mistaken. So that is kind of something that she is well versed in, is recognizing culture and the impact of your surroundings and everything playing a role and being connected. She's very good at dissecting all of that. It's a book that definitely has sat with me, certainly, even though it didn't sit with me for the usual reasons that books sit with me. Too Like the Lightning. How do I say this? Because I don't want to give anything away. And what I'm about to say is going to be very obvious. I liked this book more once I'd read all of it. Which is maybe a really stupid thing to say and pointless because, the thought is like, well, yeah, unless it tanks, isn't that what most books, don't you want to read the whole book? But for a lot of it, I was along for the ride, and it's fascinating. And I think similar to Left Hand of Darkness, she is having a lot of interesting commentary. A lot is on the table. More than I think in Left Hand of Darkness. And what I mean by more is not that she dissects it more thoroughly. I mean, Left Hand of Darkness kind of has a specialty, you could say. It's very locked into one main specific thing, although there's some others as well. This one's like really tweaking a lot of society, and I'll get to that in a moment. So I was along for the ride. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Oh, all right. Okay, let me take this in. So there's a lot to take in a way that is similar to how a lot of us describe fantasy world building, what we like about fantasy world building. I think that she excelled in that in this work. So I was really interested in all of that. From the beginning, I had like question marks kind of coming out of my brain. I was really curious, and it's the kind of book where you want to pay attention to every interaction because you feel like it plays a role in something else. It's just for so long what that something else might be, you're like, I don't know, what are we doing? Like at some point you get to a point where you start getting like almost frustrated because you're like, where is this going? And in a good way. I mean, it wasn't bad, but you're like agitated almost, or at least maybe I was, maybe other people weren't. But I kept being like, we keep introducing new things. We keep having conversations and we keep going over here and now we're going over here and I guess they're in danger. But this character seems like they're in on it. And I'd seen this described as not only science fiction, but also described as almost like a thriller as well. And you could almost say political thriller. And then I got to the end and I'm like, everything's more interesting now. And I can't really say too much else about feelings about it. But if you don't know anything about Too Like the Lightning, you follow this character who has, in some fashion, committed some crimes. And their sentence is to just basically be a good person and obey the commands they're given from people who are responsible for kind of watching them to ensure that they don't do anything else that's bad for society. You don't know what they did, and you don't know a whole lot about them. And you also, one of the questions I consistently had was, they seem very keen on continuing to watch this individual. Does that mean that they had a really important past? Does that mean they had a skill set that they don't want to let go of? Were they like some kind of political figure? Are they a threat still? Like, I was very curious because it felt like they definitely didn't have a lot of agency because it'd been robbed of them based off of whatever they'd done in the past and their sentencing, but they still seem to walk into some pretty important spaces. So I was very curious about this character. Right away, this character, you are not only introduced to them, but then a figure that they watch over, which is a child who seems to have powers, and you're like, what? Okay. And then through all of that, you're exploring this futuristic, quote-unquote, utopia, where you are looking at a society that, rather than being broken apart by countries, it's broken apart by ideologies, and you kind of can decide which you want to live in based off of how you personally view the world. And that is kind of what has allowed for harmony among the various groups, is that everybody is allowed to just live among the people that they agree with the most. And you also have some people that have more of like a breakdown of the nuclear family, and they like to live in these big groups with a lot of family members. And that's an example of like one of the areas. And they live by these different concepts, and a lot of it is influenced by like 18th century philosophy, which the author has a lot of knowledge of, so that's very baked in. One, I guess you could say, criticism I had of the story is that even though clearly the knowledge of the philosophy was there, how the characters interrogated that sometimes was not as strong as maybe I would have preferred. I mean, some of their conclusions or how they argued about things or how they discussed things wasn't as deep as I wanted, especially given how deep the world building itself is. When the characters would have conversations about things, it was a little more superficial or basic maybe than I wanted. So I kind of wish some of the thoughts had been interrogated through them. My perception was that it was just laying out, what if this is what society looked like? What would be the pros and cons of this? And how would people live within this? And what would be the conflicts that would arise? And I know that every now and then it's fun to have a book with a very clear theme, like Blood Over Bright Haven. I think its themes are pretty direct. And this one, it's just kind of allowing you to see this world and engage in it through very flawed characters, but supposedly a perfect system. And I appreciated that. I thought that was a really interesting approach. But it's a series, and I plan to keep going with the series, and I've heard the series gets better. And I am looking forward to that. Because I felt like a lot of this first book was a lot of introduction. Very fascinating introduction, but a lot of introduction nonetheless. Moving now into romantasy, there were 3 books that I read within this genre this month, 2 by the same author and within the same series, which would be books 2 and 3 in the respective series, Paladin's Strength and Paladin's Hope. And the other book I checked out was a sequel, The Dragon and the Sun Lotus. And this is a sequel to The Scorpion and the Night Blossom. I thought that The Dragon and the Sun Lotus was interesting because this is a duology, and I actually think that this is one of those instances where it might have been better as a trilogy for my tastes. As when I say might have been, and one of the few times, that sort of thing, because a lot of times with trilogies, a criticism is that I think it goes on too long, it has middle book syndrome, I think we could have cut some stuff, we could have condensed, and I think that's why duologies have become a little bit more acceptable as a means of telling a story. However, in this series case, I think a trilogy would have benefited it because of some of the character dynamics in the story. For me to have felt more invested and to really have believed in the relationships, I kind of think that having more time would have been really beneficial. I'm going to mention a trope that's present within the series, and I know most people don't care. In fact, a lot of people like knowing the tropes from romantasy and contemporary romance stories, but still, I know just mentioning certain tropes can be considered spoilery, so I'll have a timestamp that you can skip ahead if you don't want to know the trope, but it is relevant to me kind of explaining my feelings about this. So the trope is a love triangle. And in the first book, we got a little bit more with one of the character types. And then in the second book, we kind of just, we had a speed run through both of the romantic interests, but even still, I felt like we had more time with the person who was the more prominent love interest in book 1. But the ending was, it just kind of wrapped up quite quickly, and I didn't feel like what transpired really was particularly satisfying. And where I think a trilogy would have helped is if we had a decent amount of time with, I'll call them love interest 1 in book 1, and then a decent amount of time with love interest 2 in book 2, and we'd maybe built up some of the conflict with the other beings from the other realm, the kind of demon realm. If we kind of built up that conflict a little bit more, because it just sort of felt like this thing happening in the background. So we could have done that in book 2, and then in book 3, everything could have come to a head. I think a story that doesn't have the same trope, but a story that did this pretty well, and still got accused of having a little bit of middle book syndrome. But I think that even though it's Japanese folklore and it's young adult, so it's a little different. But the Shadow of the Fox trilogy, the first book kind of introduces the conflict, introduces the characters, they set out on this adventure. Book 2, the stakes are raised, everything becomes chaos. And then book 3 actually primarily is just kind of like boss rush. It's just this intense race to the finish line. And I kind of think we could have done that here and still had more time for the love story within this. And that would have, I think, really enhanced it. As a result of it not doing that, though, I did find myself slightly underwhelmed by the way things played out. And I thought certain elements at the end wrapped up almost too perfectly in a way that didn't feel necessarily earned. Because there are some stories that the happy ending, it is so desired by you, the reader, because of how much of a struggle you've watched and how much you, if we're talking about romances, have wanted the characters to be together, or how much you wanted them to finally have a little bit of peace, get to enjoy each other's company because life has thrown so much at them, or maybe the conflict has just been that all-consuming. So the happily ever after feels like, oh, thank goodness, finally everybody can rest and just be happy. And there are definitely stories where I feel that, where I think if anything happens to these characters, nothing can happen. And I know that a product of any kind of story that is romance is oftentimes you have to have a happily ever after. I'm not sure actually if that applies to romantasy. So I guess I'm a little in the dark about that. But I just didn't think the way everything kind of wrapped up was as satisfying as I was hoping it would be. Anyway, moving now to the Paladin books. So I'm a huge fan of T. Kingfisher, but my mileage varies. I like some far more than I like others. And with Paladin's strength, I quite liked the couple in this one. I thought that their banter and their dialogue was fun and it was witty. And also I just like these characters in general. I thought they matched each other quite well. It has T. Kingfisher's signature humor, and also I feel like she dials it up in these where she's just having a fun time in here. And I thought that the continuation of the main antagonistic force, I'll call it, and the mystery, it continued to play out in a way that made the plot work. If you don't know, this series has this kind of overarching problem that is affecting all of the couples in each of the individual entries. So I thought that the continuation of that worked out well, but I also have this feeling sometimes that it does come across a little bit more. A phrase I used for the previous book that I'll use again is that it comes across a little bit in the background. So it doesn't feel as hard-hitting as it could, and I do wish it had a little bit more of that, but it really is more about the couple and them falling in love and them having to deal with things and those things getting in the way of them being able to fall in love, that sort of thing. But they're fun. I don't think they're particularly hard-hitting. I wouldn't say I felt like it has strong commentary necessarily. It was just a fun time. So the couple in this one, you have these two individuals who are both aware of their size. I don't know how else to put it, but the man of the story is somebody who is a warrior type, and he is accustomed to having to try to kind of downplay his abilities because of the fact that he doesn't want to frighten people. He does care about protecting people, and so he knows that because of his size, it makes sense for him to be in this field, and he cares about what he does, but he also wants to ensure people feel safe and comfortable around him. And he's so accustomed to being kind of alone in this that when Our Lady enters the picture, she kind of has a similar dynamic, but maybe there's a little bit more to hers, and it's fantasy related, and there's a little bit of a mystery with her when it comes to that. But the two of them have a really fun dynamic overall, I think. And then if you don't know anything about this story at all, the kind of setup and the unifying factor beyond just the overarching situation is that all of the paladins are individuals who, within their world, there are multiple gods and saints and other such things, and their god gave them what are like berserker abilities within battle, but then their god died, and a lot of them actually did have the berserker part fill them when this happened, and they ended up killing a lot of people. and some of them died, some of them harmed themselves as a result of this because of the guilt they felt after the fact. And so they've kind of banded together, and there is kind of this camaraderie and brotherhood among a lot of these individuals. So we see each of these men within the books as one of our two main characters. And that is something that you're going to hear if they reference not only this, but if they reference another person that is in this group with them, that's probably one of the other characters from the other books. So that was Paladin's strength. Paladin's hope went in a totally different direction than I was expecting. I was kind of expecting to continue on with this plot. And actually, I think that the Clockwork duology by this author almost felt like it would have made more sense to read those right before and then read this, as opposed to the two books before this in its own series, because the Clockwork books, the world building pieces, felt way more relevant to this. And the whole book is kind of like this weird maze. So that was a little different. I was like, oh, this is really not what I expected at all. But it kind of had this escape room feel to it, except for with real stakes. And the two characters, I kind of liked them as well, the love interest in this. So both of them I thought were likable. One of them is kind of charming and charismatic, but because of the trauma of what happened before, he is very fearful of ever actually being too close to somebody because he still has very extreme PTSD. It makes it so that he can't even really sleep near other people because if he wakes up in a berserker state, he might harm people again. So he's very kind of standoffish. He'll have casual encounters with people, but anything deeper, he's very afraid of. And the other character is somebody who works with the dead. And I just kind of really liked him. I liked his personality. I thought he was very like sweet and kind, but also very proficient and good at what he did. And I liked their dynamic. So I have liked the interactions between the characters and the couples themselves. I just don't know that I'm really super into the plots of these necessarily, but they're kind of a fun break between some of the, heavy nonfiction or really thought-provoking sci-fi that I picked up recently. As for our contemporary romance, I tried Slippery Creatures, and I don't want to imply that all contemporary romance books should also try being a mix of another genre, but I actually did quite like the genre blending that happened within this. So this was kind of like contemporary romance, historical fiction, and it had like a thriller component to it as well. And I liked the feel of it. It made the plot a little bit more exciting, I thought. And it almost had, I don't want to give the wrong impression because the plot isn't that the character is a spy, but it had almost like this James Bond feel to it in the sense that there is like a different time period and we're looking at all these people that are from these different groups that are trying to attain something, and our characters just trying to navigate everything. And it was fun in that sense. I do think though that it made the love interest feel secondary, which is not what I was expecting from something that is a love story. There were some steamy scenes. There were definitely a few different steamy scenes in this, so it's not to say that those never occurred in the story. It's just that they kind of, it almost felt like they would just happen all of a sudden, and maybe this is part of why it made me think of James Bond, because I feel like sometimes you're going through a lot of action, and then there's espionage and deceit, and then there's this person that all of a sudden there's all this passion with, and then we go back to all of the high stakes. And I kind of feel like it had that quality to it. So I don't know that I found myself being like, oh, they're so cute, or like, oh, I hope that they can live a happy life together. I don't know that I had that necessarily, because he's kind of on the run. He's trying to escape these people. So if you're wondering what the setup is for this and how that is possibly the scenario for a contemporary romance book, you follow this young man who recently came home from fighting in World War I, and he doesn't really have much to his name. The economy is definitely really awful right now, and he fortunately was able to connect with a relative of his, and he got to know this person and cared for them quite deeply in a very short amount of time, but they were elderly and they passed away not long after these two actually finally got to meet each other. And because this elderly family member didn't really have a lot of other people in his life, he left everything to our protagonist. And one of the things that he left was his bookshop, which is not organized basically whatsoever. There are thousands of books, but our character is just happy to kind of have something in place for him, because getting work is really challenging. Finding the motivation to find passion in life after the trauma of what he's experienced in war is kind of challenging. So he just takes it upon himself to pick up after this family member. And then all of a sudden, these people are coming to him demanding he hands over something. And he doesn't know what they're looking for, but they do not seem like people you want to cross. And at first he's like, what? Who are you? Get out of here. And then another group comes in, and this group seems like they're from the government, and they're like, you must hand this over. And he's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And also, it's a free country. I don't want to do that. And he finds out quickly that neither of these groups are necessarily groups that he wants to cross. And also he's seeing that the government group maybe appreciates his willingness to stand by his country and not just hand things over, but also they really want whatever it is. And maybe if he wants to work with them, again, maybe that's another reason I got the James Bond feel. But I was like, oh, this is exciting. This is not what I was expecting necessarily. So as noted, when the romance would kick in, it was one of those, like, can we trust this person? Are they working for one of these groups, or are they just a good Samaritan? What's their backstory? What's he got going on in his life? Why is he interested just purely because he is fascinated by this scenario, or does he have ulterior motives? And so kind of seeing these two characters trying to determine things about each other, that was also exciting, but I'm not saying it had to be cute and mundane and everyday life sort of for me to enjoy it. It was very different from what I was expecting. And the reason I started this all by saying I don't need contemporary romance books to blend genres in order for me to like them, I don't mean that whatsoever. I liked this unexpected nature to this book and this approach. It wasn't quite like something I've read before. However, it did mean that I felt like the love story itself was kind of a little bit less fleshed out than I was wanting it to be, maybe. So I probably will check out other things by this author, and maybe even other books in this series. But this was a different reading experience than I've encountered before. And I'm curious for anybody who's familiar with this author and their works, or other books like this. I'm just curious your thoughts in general about that. Now getting into our fantasy, the bread and butter. So I am going to start with The Scholar in the Last Fairy Door, as well as An Alchemy of Secrets, as almost everything else is a newer release. So we'll get these backlist books talked about first. Scholar in the Last Fairy Door is by an author who I have read something else by them, and I quite enjoyed it, The Magician's Daughter. And this one, I also enjoyed it. I definitely think that there is a historical fantasy blend that this author slots into really nicely and writes really well within. I did like The Magician's Daughter more, but I still really enjoyed this one. The setup is that you follow this young woman who lives in a rural area, and her brother had gone off to war. It really affects their family as the father of the family passes away. There's a lot of kids in this family, and our character, now that her brother is gone, is the oldest among the children. So she has to take on almost like a parental role to all of them, and the rural life is not easy. And then when her brother comes home from war, a whole new host of problems enters the picture, as he has a curse placed upon him. They didn't even know magic existed. And so now you have these very important people telling them, well, magic exists. You have to basically keep this a secret. And also your brother, we don't really know how to fix this curse that is upon him, but I guess just do your best to take care of him. And the way the curse works is there are certain nights over the course of the year where he will be nearly possessed by a fae, and this fae will try to convince through him the other individuals to let them out, basically, to let them take over his body. And every single time this happens, it just kind of seems like his hold on himself is worsening, and maybe even there's a chance that he is in danger just for the loss of life that might occur if the curse spreads too much. And because of all of this, our main character is determined to try and find a way to cure him. This leads her to go to a magic school and then to study everything she can about the Fae. The problem, though, is because of this catastrophic event that occurred that not only harmed her brother but killed so many other soldiers, the magical society kind of has cut off access to the Fae world. So all the fairy doors are closed, and everything that she's researching points her in that direction for how to help her brother. So not only is she trying to learn magic, not only is she trying to enter this society that feels pretty unwelcoming to her because she didn't grow up within it and know its secrets, despite all of that, she also then has to deal with the fact that this is not magic that is known or accessible to basically anyone. And through her efforts, she joins with a few other students within this school who maybe have their own reasons for being interested in this type of magic. I found the character to be believably frustrating in the sense that she has some very realistic arguments with her family. She has some very realistic feelings about how she wants to live her life versus what is expected of her, and that place when you're caught between those things and the guilt you feel oftentimes, especially when other people are depending on you, and just finding yourself through the hardships of life. And I thought that she was frustrating because sometimes the direction she would go in, finding that balance, sometimes she would lean a little bit one way over the other, and I think she would lean too much in one direction at times. And then also sometimes in her efforts to decide, like, no, I want to do what's good for me sometimes too, sometimes she would just be selfish, or sometimes she would make some pretty bad decisions that negatively impact other people. And she's caught between a rock and a hard place. She has a lot on her plate, so you understand her, and it feels very, very believable. It doesn't change that at times you become irritated with her, and the story has this feeling of maybe she's kind of telling you about the events that have happened from a future date, so you're like, there's this ominous feel as we progress through the story. It's not like a thing that the narrative is saying constantly. It's just like the occasional line where there would be some little bit of foreshadowing, like, if I had known what was to come, I probably would have never made that decision. It's not quite that cheesy, but you understand the idea, and you're like, why? What's to come? Like, you have that intrigue built, but also you're like, oh, okay, so I'm feeling some dread here over what's to come. And I think that I liked it a lot in the first the majority of the book I really, really liked. I thought the last section, while it made sense to the story and everything that was transpiring, and I feel like it concluded everything really well, it also kind of, I'm trying not to give anything away, but it felt like it was, maybe it could have been a second book, and then had that conflict continued, or just kind of segued into it a little smoother. But I still really liked it. I don't want to give the impression I didn't. I quite liked it, and I would definitely recommend it, and I think this author overall is very underhyped. So if you've never checked out any of their works, as I said, I do like The Magician's Daughter a little bit more, but I like this one too. If you're looking for a good fall read for when the fall season is upon us, and you want something that has that kind of scholarly, almost dark academia feel, this one I think is really going to fit the bill. Alchemy of Secrets, I actually read forever ago, and I think I just forgot to ever bring it up. So I'll keep this kind of brief, but this to me felt like exactly what I expected of it to be. Meaning, Stephanie Garber has a very obvious ethereal voice. If you've read her other works, you've read Caraval, if you've read Once Upon a Broken Heart, you know what I'm talking about. It's borderline nonsensical, it's really descriptive, and it's descriptive not in a way where you go, wow, that was so straightforward, but also so cutting and really gets to the heart of what they're trying to say. It's not like that. It's like, what's the most flowery, abstract way I can describe this and make it feel like colorful and like it's textured, and how can I just put everything on the table all the time? That is kind of her writing style, and it's fun. I do think it's fun. If you go in with the eye of, but I feel like this didn't literally make sense, then you're probably not going to like her writing style, because you do have to kind of just let the feeling of what it seems like she's trying to say take over, and then be like, okay, I get the idea. But some people struggle with that because they're like, I don't feel like that made sense. So that still carried on to Alchemy of Secrets. And it starts out with our character kind of just living in everyday life, and she's really captured by this one class she's taking. And then she's discovering maybe there's more to the world than just what meets the eye. And then it just kind of goes onto this adventurous and more fantastical landscape as we navigate the story, and she's even more and more in danger, which felt very, very similar to the protagonist's plots within her previous works. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, because of the fact that her settings and her descriptions are, I think, for a lot of people what they're drawn to then kind of have a new character, and that character has their own backstory and their own personality, and they're being fitted into a new, lush and vibrant and weird setting. I think that works. So it was fun, but I wasn't necessarily incredibly moved by the story. It wasn't the hardest hitting. It was colorful, and it was fun, and it was like a I'm finding myself wanting to do what her descriptions do, which is find weird ways to describe it. It was enjoyable, but I wouldn't say it was by any means like my new favorite story or anything like that. It was a nice break. It's kind of what I said about some of the other books in this wrap-up. It was kind of a nice break between the harder-hitting types of things. Now for a lot of the new fantasy, I actually have done a number of reviews. So for a couple of these, I'm not going to go super in depth. I'll just link those reviews if you want to hear more about them. So first off, The Unicorn Hunters. Fantastic. Definitely one of my new favorite books I've read this year. Catherine Arden. And I always want to say Catherine Addison. Catherine Arden. This was so beautiful. The blend of history and fantasy was perfect in my opinion. I loved our protagonist. I loved the combination of lore and intrigue and history. I thought it all meshed beautifully. The setup for the story is that you follow Anne of Brittany, a fictional version of her, of course, and she is trying to escape this marriage that is seeming more and more inevitable to the King of France, or at the very least some other powerful political person, and she's trying to, as much as possible, maintain her hold on her land and her people, and she genuinely cares about all of them. So she's doing everything in her power to outmaneuver them, and one of the things that she does is she suggests that they take part in this unicorn hunt. And I know that sounds a little crazy. It makes more sense in the book, but this is a way to try to buy herself some time and thus see if she can outsmart her political adversaries. It was great. I can't recommend it enough. Of course, people have different tastes, so maybe you're not into historical fantasy, and maybe you prefer more epic settings, or you prefer brand new worlds, and in that case, this isn't really going to work for you, but I thought for what it was delivering on, it delivered on it so well. And then Her Hidden Fire, and also To Ride a Rising Storm, I did reviews for those, and I think Her Hidden Fire, the biggest takeaway that I want, I guess, for people to have is that I don't know that it's necessarily the best marketed, because it's marketed as more so like romantasy, and I would say it's a blend, certainly, but I actually felt like the motivation to turn the page was not rooted in anything to do with the romance. It was everything to do with the situations our character found herself in, the world, and the character herself. So the setup for this story is that you follow this young woman who her best friend, and also somebody that she has romantic feelings for, they are this last person within their family line who has a chance to still hold on to the family, everything that the family has, as within their society there are certain people that have magical abilities. They get tested when they're young, and they can go into two groups, but regardless, they need to show signs that they have this magic, and if they don't, their land will be taken and somebody else will go into to be in charge of everything. So it's very important to this young man that he has this magic, and they just won't know until he's tested if he does. Our main character determines very quickly, she is not somebody of high birth, but she determines very quickly that she does have magic, and so when his test is happening, she is so worried for him, and she cares so deeply for him, that she decides maybe it would be best to try and use some of her magic to make it seem like he has magic, and then she can go with him to this school setting where they learn more about it, and I think that's where things really take off, and a lot of moral grayness gets presented, if not just villainous things about their magic system gets presented. So she has this idea of maybe it would be best if I sacrificed my anonymity and I actually joined him. And they wouldn't know that she was the one granting this ability to him. They would just see that he has powers, and then they test her and be like, I guess you have powers too. And they would both go to this place, but because she's not of high birth, very quickly she's realizing that they are not seen as equal. To Ride a Rising Storm is a sequel specifically to Shape a Dragon's Breath. So I'll say a little bit about book 1. In this, we follow this young woman named Anakus, who is somebody who is an indigenous person who, after bonding with a dragon, is forced to go to this school where they impose onto them the correct way to bond with your dragon, and also they're trying to force her to assimilate into their society and their culture and what they deem proper and civilized. So you're exploring, and I don't even have to say what the themes are, but you're exploring a lot of the dynamics that Anakus faces with a lot of the other characters, and people that just hate her for everything they think that she represents, and how she is just this beacon for them when it comes to where to direct all of the horrible views they have about certain groups of people, and her just trying to do everything she can to maintain this bond that she has with her dragon. You do have a really interesting magic system with this. It is alternate history fantasy, so slight distinction, I think, between historical fiction and alternate history is alternate history, oftentimes there is like a very key difference. We're not trying too much to make things exactly as they were, but rather we're trying to say, like, well, what if this thing, though, happened or was in existence, then how would that slightly shape things? And so for this story, the big thing is that there are dragons, which have shaped a lot of folklore, a lot of the ways in which their cultures developed in different places, and there are different kinds of dragons and other such things. So book 1, I thought was fantastic. Really, really loved it. I have highly recommended it ever since I picked it up. I did think that the sequel felt like it had middle book syndrome, just maybe more than just a little bit, and it's a lot of building. And at first I was really excited, and I was excited to be back, and I was like, okay, so we're transitioning out of the intensity that was the end of book 1. We're building into what's going to be intense in book 2, and then also then in book 3, and then I'm like, okay, we're still building. We're building some more. We're revisiting this conversation. We're also revisiting this other conversation. We kind of already did this conversation twice already, but I guess, okay, we'll do it a third time. And it just kind of kept building, and then stuff does happen, but it took a really long time. So I'm hopeful that this is going to be at least 4 books, because I think there's just so much that we've implied is going to be explored and that we've foreshadowed, and I just don't know if we're going to be able to get all of that in one single other book, but we'll see. So book 1 currently still a lot stronger for me than book 2, but I'm still hopeful for book 3. For these last 2, I'm just going to briefly mention them, as one of them is an arc. So I'm just going to say I have read An Edge Sharp Enough. Really, really cool world, really cool ideas, some interesting twists and turns over the course of the story. The tricky part, though, is that this is an arc, and arcs do not have a set, understood amount of presentation across them from one arc to the next. You might get one that is basically the final version, and another one that clearly is not done yet. This one leaned into that territory. So I will talk about this one more when its release is, which is not for a while, but currently I think that all those other things I stated as positives are very true of it, but there are some things about the story that I'm assuming are going to get ironed out in editing. Some things that just legitimate, like, oh, I think this is just the wrong word, or this sentence was clunky, or we used the same word several times, that kind of stuff. But I don't even mean that necessarily. I mean kind of like more how, because it is multiple perspective, when we come back to certain characters, it can feel like we're having kind of this jump in the dynamics between the characters. And sometimes the tone even felt like it was shifting. So you'll get one moment that feels kind of like dark fantasy, it's intense, and then you'll get to another part where it feels more youthful and innocent and adventurous. And I don't even necessarily think it was related to the characters themselves. Some of it felt like there were just tonal differences across the perspectives. And again, that can all be very, very cleaned up within the time from now to when it's released. I just don't know. But the setup for the story is quite fascinating. So you have this faraway enemy that has wreaked havoc on this land, and it has resulted in a lot of different places just having to submit and give up their independence. There is one area that is kind of still holding out, And that is where we see one of our characters who is part of this brutal program to try and raise assassins, basically. And they try to take away from them every semblance of their humanity so that they just serve this cause so they can try to bring salvation to their people, if you want to call it that. And then you have another character that's a part of this more developed city, and they seem to have something that's right about to happen. There's like all these almost like murder mystery plot lines occurring where you're trying to figure out how does this relate to these characters and what's going to happen. And one of the characters is basically like a detective law enforcement type of character. Another character is a part of this noble class, or what would have more so been seen as nobles before this revolution happened. But still, there are clearly class distinctions. And she is a part of this family that is very revered in their society because her mother created something that helped them when it came to standing on their own, separating from like this religious organization and a lot of the history that kept them shackled for a lot of years. That religious organization still exists. They're still trying to prove why their way of life is important and why the rest of the city should listen to them. Her mother and most of the rest of the city, they have their own ways of doing things and they push back a lot. So all of that, super fascinating, trying to figure out how the characters are going to connect, figuring out that in the background threats, and then is that connected to this mystery that's going on with this detective character, and then how is that going to interact with this, and then what about this other assassin-like character that's over here. So all of it was intriguing, and it was definitely building and building and building as it went, but as noted, I read an arc, so some of the smoothness of the story, I hope, will be there when it is officially released. And then Nine Goblins, I have started, I haven't finished. But I'm like, is this going to be one of my favorite T. Kingfisher books? It's so stupid and on purpose. It's a novella. It follows some goblins, and there's a conflict with elves and humans. And in their efforts to fight, they end up being transported after something happens with a wizard to behind enemy lines. And now they're just trying to get out. And I don't think read anything that makes me think more of Pompoko. So if you don't know what Pompoko is, it's one of the lesser known Studio Ghibli films. It's great. It has very similar themes to Mononoke, but it doesn't tell the story even close to the same way. It's almost like a documentary about some tanuki who are battling it out against people. And they're all just like lazy and they're slobs and they just like love to watch TV and eat, but they're super lovable and they just want to maintain their way of life. And that is so similar to Nine Goblins. And it's kind of just this story about the constant need to like take more, and to push out people that are just minding their business, or to not even consider the land and the animals and everybody who inhabits this place already. It's one of those kinds of stories, and those are the themes that are present, but it's just told in such a purposefully stupid way. But when I say stupid, I hope you know what I mean. Like, it's so obviously meant to be campy, but then it makes the sad stuff even worse because you're like, no, they're just like lovable idiots. I don't want bad things to happen to them. If you've never seen Pompoko, I highly recommend it. And I will update on Nine Goblins when I finish it, probably in the next wrap-up, or possibly even the best of the quarter, because it might make my best of the quarter. I'm really quite enjoying it. And there's some really, like, there's a part, to give you an example of what I mean by like the stupidity of it. There's a part where when they see the wizard, they're talking about how all wizards are crazy. And then it has this ridiculous line that's like, and we don't mean crazy like the way people say, like, you gotta be a little bit crazy to hang out with us. Not that kind of crazy. Like, they're legitimately crazy. And they call it like AMD or something like that. Something magic, or MDS, like magical derangement syndrome, or so. I can't remember what they call it, but like, it's just really, really cheeky and silly. And there's a self-awareness to the story as well. So there's like one part where they're walking into this farm and it's creepy and there's this sinister feel. And it says something like, if everything was right in the world, there would be this long, loud creak as they opened the door. But alas, it was on some rope or something. So it just like opened quietly. Stuff like that. And I am thoroughly enjoying it. But we'll see. I don't imagine it's going to crash and burn. But some of the humor, you're like, okay, I get it. You know, similar joke from before. Maybe you overuse a certain joke a tiny bit here and there, but I am really quite liking this one. Anyway, we'll get to this one when I've completed it. That's it though for our June wrap up. If you'd like to mention your thoughts on any of these books, feel free to do so. If you'd like to check any of them out, I will have a pinned comment so you can click on anything there and check these books out for yourself. And then if you have any recommendations, as always, feel free to leave those. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.